For 50 years, Edward denied me a wedding, claiming it was unnecessary. Yet on our 50th anniversary, I watched him celebrate with Vivian, the woman he said was dying of cancer. What no one knew was that decades ago, I discovered Vivian's darkest secret. They thought I was a bitter old woman when I walked away. In truth, I was the only one who knew the reality of what they were celebrating. For nearly 5 decades, Edward Harrington and I never celebrated our marriage properly. First, he claimed finances were tight, that as long as we had each other, formal recognition didn't matter. Later, he insisted we'd been together so long that ceremony was pointless. But on our 50th anniversary, he finally organized a lavish celebration that left our entire community speechless. Not for me, but for Vivian, the woman he'd apparently loved from afar all these years. What he never realized was that I'd known Vivian's darkest secret for decades, a truth that made walking away not just necessary, but liberating. My name is Margaret Wilson, and at 72, I've spent 50 exhausting years being the backbone of a marriage that was never truly mine. From our early days in that cramped one-bedroom apartment to the spacious colonial home we eventually built together, I was always the one making sacrifices. I raised our daughter Charlotte with unwavering devotion and now help care for our grandchildren with the same dedication I once showed their mother. Our relationship followed a predictable pattern. Edward pursued his career relentlessly while I managed everything else: the home, our social calendar, family relationships. When he needed perfectly pressed shirts for important meetings, I stayed up late ironing. When business associates came for dinner, I prepared elaborate meals he took credit for planning. When Charlotte had school events, I attended alone, always with an excuse ready for Edward's absence. I believed this arrangement was temporary, that eventually we would become true partners. But 5 decades later, as I watched my husband place a ring on another woman's finger, I finally accepted the painful truth. I had never been his choice. I was merely the woman who made his real life possible. I stood frozen among the rose bushes of lakeside gardens, watching my husband of 50 years kiss another woman. The elaborate white tent, crystal champagne flutes, and string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon created the perfect backdrop for their love story. Edward had spared no expense, the same man who told me repeatedly throughout our marriage that ceremonies were wasteful sentimentality. Vivian Carson looked radiant in her cream silk dress, her silver hair elegantly styled. At 68, she maintained the graceful poise that had made her the most sought-after socialite in Millfield Heights decades ago. The crowd of nearly 200 guests, many faces I recognized as our mutual friends, applauded as Edward dipped her in a theatrical kiss. Among the cheering crowd stood Charlotte, our only daughter, raising her glass in celebration. The sight of her there, supporting this charade, sent a cold wave through my body. Had she known? For how long? The betrayal doubled as I realized my own child had chosen sides before I even knew there was a choice to make. I hadn't intended to witness this spectacle. A call from my dear friend Elaine brought me here. "Margaret, I don't know how to tell you this, but Edward has reserved Lakeside Gardens for today. There's a ceremony with Vivian Carson." The name alone was enough. Vivian Carson, Edward's college sweetheart who supposedly moved to Europe decades ago. The woman whose name he occasionally murmured in his sleep. The woman whose secret I had accidentally discovered 25 years earlier while organizing Edward's office. A secret so damaging it could destroy not just her reputation, but her entire carefully constructed identity. As Edward slipped a diamond ring onto Vivian's finger, far larger than the simple band he'd given me in our courthouse wedding, I felt something unexpected. Not heartbreak, but release. 50 years of doubt suddenly crystallized into certainty. I had never been the love of Edward's life. I had been the convenient choice, the reliable option, the caretaker. That evening, I returned to our colonial house on Maple Avenue. the home where I'd planted every perennial in the garden and selected every piece of furniture. I sat alone in the darkened living room, no dinner prepared, no lights turned on. The grandfather clock Edward had inherited from his father ticked loudly in the hallway, marking the moments of my unraveling life. When the front door opened and lights flooded the room, Charlotte gasped, "Mom, what are you doing sitting here in the dark?" Behind her stood Edward, still wearing his celebration suit, and my granddaughters Emma and Lily, looking uncomfortable. I met Charlotte's gaze. "Where were you all today?" Charlotte exchanged a glance with her father. "Just running errands, Mom." "Why are you acting so strange?" Edward stepped forward, loosening his tie. "Margaret, you should be in bed. It's late." "It's 7:30, Edward." I kept my voice steady. "I want to know where you were today." Charlotte sighed dramatically. "Mom, please don't start with the interrogations. We just had a busy day." I pulled out my phone and showed them the photo Elaine had sent me. Edward and Vivian cutting a 3-tiered cake, "Forever at Last" written in elegant script across the top. Edward's face hardened. "You were spying on me? That's beneath you, Margaret." "Beneath me?" I laughed coldly. "More beneath me than celebrating a wedding with another woman on our anniversary?" Charlotte moved between us. "Mom, you don't understand. Vivian has terminal cancer. She wanted to experience a proper celebration before." She trailed off, but her implication was clear. "Before she dies." "Dad was just doing something kind," Charlotte continued. "Why are you making this into something ugly? It was symbolic, not real." I stared at my daughter, this woman I'd raised with unwavering devotion, now defending the public humiliation of her own mother. Her loyalty lay not with me, but with the father who had been absent for most of her childhood milestones. The choice was clear in her eyes. Edward's reputation mattered more than my dignity. "Terminal cancer?" I repeated, unable to hide my disbelief. "Vivian Carson doesn't have cancer." "How would you know?" Charlotte snapped. "You've barely spoken to her in decades." I could have revealed Vivian's secret right then, the truth I'd discovered buried in Edward's old correspondence. But something stopped me. Perhaps it was dignity, perhaps exhaustion. Either way, I was done. I walked to the antique secretary desk in the corner, a wedding gift from my parents, and withdrew a manila envelope I'd prepared months ago when I first noticed Edward's increasingly frequent business trips and unexplained absences. "What's that?" Edward asked, his voice suddenly cautious. "Divorce papers," I replied, placing them on the coffee table. "I've had them drawn up for some time. Call it intuition." The silence that followed was deafening. Charlotte's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Edward stared at the papers as though they might bite. "You can't be serious," he finally managed. "We're in our 70s, Margaret. Be reasonable." "Precisely why I won't waste another day," I answered. "I've spent 50 years in a marriage where I was never truly seen or valued. I won't spend whatever time I have left feeling the same way." Edward's composure cracked slightly. "This is ridiculous. Where would you even go?" "I've maintained my own savings account for decades," I said, "and I still own my mother's lake house. I've kept it all these years, though you've always wondered why." Something like respect flickered across Edward's face momentarily. I'd surprised him. Good. Charlotte looked between us, panicked. "Mom, you're overreacting. This whole thing with Vivian was just a kind gesture. Dad loves you." I turned to my daughter. "Charlotte, I love you deeply, but you don't know everything about your father or Vivian Carson. And I won't stoop to explaining myself to people who've already decided I'm in the wrong." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of half a century lifting from my shoulders. "I'll be gone by morning. I suggest you both consider what family really means in my absence." The lake house stood as I'd left it during my last visit 6 months ago, small but sturdy, with wide windows facing the water. My mother had purchased it with her inheritance money, the one financial decision my father hadn't controlled. Now it became my sanctuary. The first few days passed in a fog. I unpacked the single suitcase I'd brought, arranging my limited possessions in the pine dresser that had been my grandmother's. Charlotte called repeatedly, her messages growing increasingly desperate, then angry, then accusatory. I listened to each one before ultimately silencing my phone. "You're tearing this family apart," her final message declared. "Dad is devastated, and the girls don't understand why Grandma suddenly disappeared. All because you couldn't be happy for Vivian in her final months." I laughed bitterly at that. Vivian's final months. The woman had been perpetuating that particular lie for decades. It was part of what I'd discovered in Edward's office all those years ago. Sitting on the dock one evening, watching the sunset paint the lake orange and pink, I allowed myself to really examine our marriage. Edward and I had met through mutual friends during my final year of nursing school. He was beginning his medical residency, handsome, ambitious, from a good family, as my mother had approvingly noted. I remembered how I'd worked overtime to help support us during his early career, how I'd typed his research papers, organized his files, entertained his colleagues. When Charlotte was born, I'd given up my nursing career without hesitation, because Edward insisted our daughter needed a full-time mother. For 50 years, I'd molded myself to fit the spaces Edward left open, careful never to outshine him, never to inconvenience him. I'd believed that sacrifice was the foundation of love, that selflessness would eventually be recognized and reciprocated. How wrong I'd been. A decade into our marriage, Edward had received a letter from Vivian. He'd hidden it, but I'd found it while cleaning. The first thread that, when pulled, unraveled the tapestry of lies I'd later discover. But I'd ignored it then, convinced that loyalty would eventually earn me the love I deserved. Now, at 72, I finally understood. I had never been Edward's great love. I had been his great convenience. After 2 weeks of solitude, I woke one morning and decided, enough reflection. It was time to start living. I began with small changes. I rearranged the lake house furniture to suit my preferences rather than preserving my mother's layout. I painted the kitchen a cheerful yellow instead of the practical beige Edward would have insisted upon. I stayed up late reading novels I'd been meaning to enjoy for years, and woke when my body was ready, not when someone else's schedule dictated. When my neighbor Eleanor invited me to join the local book club, I accepted without worrying about who would prepare Edward's dinner or iron his shirts. When the community center advertised watercolor classes, I signed up, reclaiming the artistic passion I'd abandoned 5 decades earlier. I opened a new bank account, transferred my savings, and met with a divorce attorney recommended by Eleanor. She was sharp, compassionate, and notably unsurprised by my situation. "You'd be amazed how common this is," she said. "Decades of marriage, then suddenly one spouse discovers their partner had a parallel emotional life all along." "What makes my case different," I told her, "is what I know about Vivian Carson." The attorney leaned forward. "And what exactly do you know?" I shook my head. "I'm keeping that card close for now. Let's just say Vivian's terminal illness is as fictional as my husband's faithfulness." 1 month into my new life, I received an unexpected visitor. My granddaughter Emma, now 18, stood on my porch with a small backpack. "I found your address in Mom's desk," she explained, shuffling nervously. "Can I stay for a few days?" Things are tense at home. I welcomed her in, prepared her favorite tea, and listened as she hesitantly shared what had been happening since my departure. "Grandpa moved this woman Vivian into the house," she said. "Mom acts like it's normal, but it's weird. Vivian rearranged all the furniture and threw out your cookbooks. She doesn't even seem sick, despite everyone saying she's dying." I smiled slightly, unsurprised. "And your mother? How's Charlotte handling all this?" Emma looked down. She's pretending everything's fine, but I've heard her crying at night. I think she misses you, even though she won't admit it. For the first time since leaving, I felt a flicker of hope for my relationship with my daughter. Perhaps the truth would eventually become too obvious for even Charlotte to deny. Emma's visit stretched from days into weeks. She enrolled in the local community college's summer program and found a part-time job at the Lakeside Cafe. Her presence filled the small house with youthful energy, and I discovered a relationship with my granddaughter that I'd never had the freedom to develop before. "Grandma, you're so different here," she remarked one evening as we painted on the dock. "I always thought you were just, I don't know, quiet, but you're funny and have all these opinions and talents." I smiled, recognizing the subtle tragedy in her observation. "I was always this person, Emma. I just didn't have the space to show it." Through Emma, I met other women in the lake community, mostly retirees, many divorced or widowed. We formed an informal group that met for coffee every Thursday morning. These women became my confidants, offering wisdom, humor, and understanding without judgment. There was Diane, who had left her husband after discovering his 20-year affair with his secretary. Helen, whose husband's gambling addiction had demolished their retirement savings. And Patricia, who'd been widowed young and built an independent life she fiercely cherished. "We call ourselves the Phoenix Club," Patricia told me with a wink, "because we've all risen from the ashes of something." During one of our gatherings, I finally shared the full story of Edward and Vivian, including the secret I discovered decades ago. "I found letters," I explained. "Correspondence between Vivian and a doctor in Switzerland. She wasn't traveling Europe as she claimed. She was institutionalized for nearly 2 years after having a complete psychological breakdown. She fabricated an elaborate lie about working with humanitarian organizations to cover it up." "And that's relevant now because," Diane prompted, "because this terminal cancer is just another of her manipulations. She's done this before, claimed serious illnesses when she needed attention or wanted something. In the letters, her doctor specifically noted this pattern." My friends exchanged glances. "Why haven't you exposed her?" Helen asked. I sipped my tea thoughtfully. "Originally, I stayed silent out of loyalty to Edward. Now, I'm waiting. Sometimes justice arrives more effectively when you don't force it." Patricia squeezed my hand. "Well, whatever happens, you have us now, your real family." Looking around at these women, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: belonging, not as someone's wife or mother, but simply as myself. 3 months into my new life, I ventured into Millfield Heights to attend an art exhibition featuring some of my watercolors from class. It was my first return to the town where Edward and I had built our life together, and I deliberated for weeks about whether to go. "You have to," Emma had insisted. "Your paintings are amazing, and anyway, it's your town too." The gallery was warm and crowded when I arrived. I'd just accepted a glass of champagne when I heard a familiar voice. "Margaret? Is that you?" Vivian Carson stood before me, looking remarkably healthy for someone supposedly dying of cancer. Her hair was freshly colored, her makeup impeccable, her designer dress fitting perfectly. "Vivian," I acknowledged coolly, "you're looking well for someone on death's door." Her practiced smile faltered. "Medical miracles happen every day. I've responded exceptionally well to treatment." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I actually wanted to speak with you," she continued, lowering her voice. "This situation with Edward, I know it must be difficult, but we've all reached an age where life is too short for resentment. Edward misses you. As his friend, I thought perhaps I could help mend things." "Friend?" I sipped my champagne. "Is that what you call it?" Her smile tightened. "Margaret, please. I know we were never close, but surely we can be civil. Edward and I have a special connection, yes, but that doesn't diminish what you and he shared." I was about to respond when I noticed several people nearby watching our exchange with undisguised interest. Among them was Barbara Lawson, the town's most notorious gossip. "I understand completely," I said loudly enough for them to hear. "And how is the terminal cancer these days?" Edward told everyone it was quite serious. Stage 4, wasn't it? Vivian's face flushed. I've been fortunate. The doctors are calling it a remarkable recovery." "Remarkable indeed," I agreed. "Almost miraculous. One might call it fictional." Barbara Lawson inched closer, transparently eavesdropping. "You're being ridiculous," Vivian hissed. "Edward told me you'd become bitter and delusional. I see he was right." She raised her voice for our audience. "I'm so sorry your mental health has deteriorated, Margaret. Edward warned me you might make a scene. Perhaps it's time you sought professional help." The smug look on her face as several onlookers shook their heads sympathetically was almost too much to bear. In one calculated move, she'd managed to position me as the unstable, jealous ex-wife, and herself as the compassionate victim. As whispers rippled through the gallery, I realized I was losing control of my carefully constructed new narrative. Vivian wasn't just taking my husband. She was taking my dignity and credibility, too. I fled the gallery, abandoning my moment of artistic pride. The cool evening air did little to soothe the burning humiliation I felt. My phone buzzed incessantly. Apparently, news traveled fast in Millfield Heights. By morning, the damage was extensive. Charlotte called, her voice tight with controlled fury. "How could you, Mom? Confronting Vivian publicly about her cancer? Do you have any idea how cruel that looks?" "It's not cruel to question a lie," I replied, but my voice lacked conviction. "You're obsessed. Dad told me you've been fixated on some conspiracy theory about Vivian's medical history for years. It's unhealthy. Maybe you should talk to someone professional." The words stung worse coming from my daughter than from Vivian. Charlotte had trusted Edward's version without question. Again. Even Emma seemed uncertain when she returned from visiting her mother. "Mom showed me some posts online," she said hesitantly. "People are saying you went off on Vivian about her cancer in the middle of the gallery." I sat heavily on the porch swing, suddenly feeling every one of my 72 years. "And you believe them?" Emma fidgeted. "I don't know what to believe anymore. Mom says you've invented this whole story about Vivian faking illnesses because you can't accept that Grandpa loved someone else." For the first time since leaving Edward, doubt crept in. Had I misinterpreted everything? Those letters were decades old. Perhaps I'd built an entire narrative around fragments that meant something entirely different. Maybe Edward was right. Maybe I had become delusional. That night, I pulled out the folder where I'd kept copies of the correspondence I'd discovered. Reading through them again, the evidence seemed less concrete than I remembered. One doctor mentioning patterns of fabricated symptoms could have meant anything. What if I had built my entire justification for leaving on a misunderstanding? The next morning, I couldn't get out of bed. The weight of possible error pressed down on me. If I was wrong about Vivian's deception, what else was I wrong about? Had I thrown away 50 years of marriage over a misinterpretation? Patricia came by after I missed our Phoenix Club meeting. She found me still in my nightgown at 2 p.m, staring blankly at the wall. "Margaret," she said gently, sitting beside me, "what's happened?" "What if I made a terrible mistake?" I whispered. "What if I'm the villain in this story?" I had been so certain of my new direction, so confident in my decisions. Now that certainty was crumbling, and with it, my newfound sense of self. Patricia listened patiently as I shared my doubts, then asked a simple question. "Can I see those letters?" We spread the yellowed pages across my kitchen table. Patricia, a retired librarian with a methodical mind, examined each document carefully. "Margaret," she said finally, "there's nothing ambiguous here. This doctor explicitly states that Vivian Carson exhibited a consistent pattern of fabricating medical conditions for emotional manipulation and attention. That's not open to interpretation." She tapped another letter. And here, the doctor warns that without proper treatment, she would likely continue this behavior throughout her life. A knock at the door interrupted us. Diane and Helen entered, followed by 3 other women from the Phoenix Club. "We heard what happened at the gallery," Helen announced. "We're not letting you face this alone." For the next several hours, these women, who had each weathered their own storms, surrounded me with unwavering support. They analyzed the evidence objectively, confirming what I had known but begun to doubt. I wasn't crazy or vindictive. I was standing up for the truth. "You know what you need?" Diane declared finally. "Your own narrative. You've been letting Edward and Vivian control the story. It's time you told your version." "But who would believe me?" I asked. "I'm just the bitter ex-wife." "Start with the people who matter," Patricia suggested. "Your daughter deserves to know the truth, even if she chooses not to believe it." That evening, I wrote Charlotte a long email, attaching scanned copies of the most damning evidence about Vivian's history of fabricated illnesses. I explained that I had kept silent for decades out of respect for her father, but I could no longer allow myself to be painted as delusional. "I don't expect this to change your relationship with your father," I wrote, "but you should know that I didn't leave on a whim or out of jealousy. I left because 50 years of devotion was repaid with lies and public humiliation." I hesitated before pressing send, wondering if I was making things worse. Then Emma placed her hand over mine. "Send it, Grandma," she said firmly. "Mom needs to see this, even if she's not ready to accept it yet." As the email disappeared into the digital ether, I felt something hard and heavy lift from my chest. Whatever happened next, I had reclaimed my voice. I had asserted my truth. The following day, Eleanor invited me to join her for the Lake County Senior Citizens Art Leadership position, an opportunity I would never have considered in my previous life. "You have talent, Margaret," she insisted. "And more importantly, you understand how creativity can heal." For the first time in weeks, I looked to the future with anticipation rather than dread. My life wasn't over at 72. In many ways, it was just beginning. A month passed with no response from Charlotte. I focused on my art leadership role, finding unexpected fulfillment in helping others discover creativity late in life. My watercolors were featured in a regional exhibition, and I began teaching weekend classes at the community center. Then one rainy Tuesday, Charlotte appeared at my door unannounced, looking exhausted and years older than her 45 years. "May I come in?" she asked tentatively. I stepped aside, my heart hammering. We sat in awkward silence before she finally spoke. "You were right about Vivian," she said, her voice barely audible. "All of it." She explained that after receiving my email, she'd been skeptical but concerned enough to investigate. She'd contacted a friend who worked at the hospital where Edward claimed Vivian was receiving treatment. "There were no records," Charlotte said. "No oncology appointments, no chemotherapy, nothing." When confronted, Vivian had become defensive, then hysterical. Edward had defended her until Charlotte produced evidence that couldn't be dismissed. "It all unraveled so quickly after that," Charlotte continued. "Dad started questioning other things Vivian had told him. He discovered she'd been manipulating their finances, making large withdrawals from his accounts. When he confronted her, she changed. It was frightening, Mom. Like watching someone transform into a completely different person." Vivian had destroyed Edward's study in a rage, shredding medical documents and breaking family heirlooms. When she realized she'd lost control of the situation, she pivoted dramatically, collapsing with supposed chest pains. "The ambulance came," Charlotte said. "The doctors found nothing wrong, but she insisted on staying hospitalized. She's now claiming emotional abuse from Dad, from me, from everyone. She's threatening to sue." Charlotte looked up, tears streaming down her face. "And the worst part? Dad knew. Not everything maybe, but enough. He admitted that years ago, he found some of the same letters you discovered. He chose to ignore the red flags because he wanted to believe in their great love story. I felt no satisfaction at this vindication, only a deep sadness for the wasted years and damaged relationships. "Where is your father now?" I asked gently. "Staying with friends. He's not well. This whole thing has broken something in him." Charlotte hesitated. "He's been asking for you." I shook my head. "I can't go back, Charlotte, not even for this." She nodded slowly. "I understand. I wouldn't either." She reached for my hand. "Mom, I'm so sorry for not believing you, for the things I said, for everything." As we embraced, I realized that sometimes justice arrives in its own time, in its own way. Edward and Vivian had created their own punishment through decades of deception. My reward was the freedom I'd finally claimed for myself. 2 years have passed since I walked away from my 50-year marriage. I've celebrated my 74th birthday surrounded by true friends, my daughter, and both granddaughters who now visit regularly. The lake house has been renovated, not to anyone else's taste but my own, with a sun-filled studio where I paint almost daily. Last month, my watercolor series Second Beginnings opened at a respected gallery in the city. Charlotte brought Lily and Emma to the opening, and we celebrated afterward with my Phoenix Club friends. Looking around that table, at the women who had supported me through my darkest hours, and the family who had found their way back to me, I felt a contentment I'd never known in 5 decades of marriage. Edward eventually reached out through a handwritten letter, expressing remorse and asking for forgiveness. I responded not with anger or vindication, but with peace. "I forgive you, not for your sake, but for mine. I wish you healing on your journey forward." I heard through Charlotte that he sold our old house and moved to Arizona to be near his brother. Vivian, unable to maintain her elaborate deceptions, reportedly moved back east after a brief hospitalization for genuine mental health treatment. Their great love story collapsed under the weight of its own falsehoods. As for me, I've discovered that life can offer surprising gifts at any age. 6 months ago, I met Arthur, a retired professor who teaches literature at the community center. Our friendship evolved naturally into something deeper, a relationship founded on mutual respect and genuine appreciation rather than convenience or obligation. Unlike my relationship with Edward, Arthur and I maintain our separate homes and independent lives while sharing our interests and affections. When he asked if I would ever consider remarrying, I laughed and told him I was done with institutions. "But I'm not done with love," I added. Sometimes in the evening, Arthur and I sit on my dock watching the sunset, discussing books, or planning our upcoming trip to Italy, my first journey abroad. In these moments, I marvel at how different life becomes when you finally give yourself permission to live it on your own terms. The other day, Emma asked if I regretted staying with Edward for 50 years before finding the courage to leave. "No," I answered truthfully. "Every choice I made led me here, to this version of myself that I've come to value and respect. I wouldn't change the path because I cherish the destination." That night, painting in my studio as moonlight reflected off the lake, I realized the most important lesson of my journey. It's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. At 74, I'm not finished becoming. I'm just getting started. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to walk away from what no longer serves you and toward what brings you joy. My only regret is that I didn't do it sooner. But then again, perhaps everything unfolds exactly when it's supposed to.